Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Well, we had to start sometime, John. So you might have noticed it's sunny outside, and we're inside, and so you know the gratitude of the presenter tonight, that's me, is just overwhelmed by the fact that the sun is shining and making nice silhouettes of the trees out there. So we could be outside, but we're here, and I really appreciate you coming tonight. My name is Tony Charles. I'm with the School of the Environment and the School of Business, both of those schools here at St. Mary's University. This event is sponsored, hosted by the School of the Environment, and that's a relatively new entity here at the university. I was its first director for 3 years until recently. And now Linda Campbell is acting as the director. There are some flyers for the School of the Environment up here. There's also some flyers for the Community Conservation Research Network, which I'm going to talk about tonight, some of the work that we've been doing. And some of you that were here a little earlier, there was the website of the CCRN showing on the screen. So tonight, I hope will be both interesting for you, but also an opportunity for some of you, those who might feel like it, to participate a bit. This is an evening about community solutions, community stories about protecting the environment and protecting jobs and livelihoods. And to give away a bit of my punchline, I've been seeing, professionally and personally, all around Nova Scotia, all around the world, just so many examples. Everywhere you go, there's an example of a local community, a particular place that's doing something, protecting the environment and protecting their livelihoods, their abilities to keep going. And so that's economic, but it's also just their culture and their way of life, their well-being. And it's amazing, it's inspiring, I find, and that's really the theme of tonight, that community solutions can be good for the earth and the economy. And this night tonight, this Earth Day session, Earth Day is actually tomorrow, but we don't have to worry about that. It's a set of days that celebrate Earth Day. And this year, for the first time, the famous Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., pioneered an activity called Earth Optimism. And the idea of Earth Optimism is to look at positive examples, not the sad stories about the environment that really get a lot of attention, and for good reason, because they're kind of scary cases of environmental problems, and we have them here in Nova Scotia, of course, as do elsewhere, but really to celebrate the optimism about the Earth. And so in Washington, D.C., in London, England, and really if you look at the Earth Optimism website, really all around the world, there are events going on today and tomorrow that are celebrating not only Earth Day, but this idea of Earth Optimism. And before I go too far along here, and also not to mention the fact that there's a couple of EAC, Ecology Action Center people here, I want to point out that tonight's event and events tomorrow that the Ecology Action Center are holding are part of a wonderful package that we put together jointly, St. Mary's University and the Ecology Action Center, to celebrate this Earth Optimism idea. So if you're interested, and I'll mention this again later, but you can certainly have a look at some of the events that Ecology Action Center is running tomorrow, and the website, ecologyaction.ca/Earth Day, if you're wanting to check into that a bit more. So today is almost Earth Day. Last year at this time, I gave a talk celebrating Earth Day, and part of my position at St. Mary's University has become to give an annual lecture around Earth Day. Last year I talked about Nova Scotia's and the potential for a green economy. And I described a few strategies for shifting Nova Scotia toward a more green economy that links environment and economics. And there were a number of measures that I won't go through tonight, but one particular one that I highlight because it is a passion for me is the power of community, of people coming together in their local communities to make a difference. So that was a theme from last year, and that's what I want to. There are other strategies that I think are very important as well, but that's a particular angle that I want to focus on today. So communities. There's a lot of different kinds of communities. There are different ways of talking about community. If you were a social scientist, you could debate with other social scientists for your whole career the idea of a community. But today I'm going to focus on what are sometimes called place-based communities or local communities, communities that are in a particular place. Now there are also ethnic communities and language communities and other ways you can talk about the word community, but I'm going to talk about places. Places like what you see around the screen there, and I'll go through these a little bit as we go along, but if you have a particular passion for a place, a community, I hope that later on in the evening you might like to say a few words yourself to the group here about how that community deals with its local environment and its local economy, and especially how those can come together in a positive way, which these are all examples of that kind of positiveness. Now, I mentioned about this Community Conservation Research Network. Our basic idea here is to ask this question: how do communities protect their environment and sustain their local economy at the same time? How does that work? It's not an easy question because there are many different ways that you can keep the environment healthy and keep the economy going as well. And how can governments help? How can government policy support local communities? Well, what does that look like? I'm not going to talk too much about myself, but I first started thinking about this particular question about protecting their environment or sustaining their use of the environment and sustaining the economy, well, a while ago, but in particular 25 years ago this year, there was, off the coast here, one of the largest collapses of a natural resource in modern history, the collapse of the cod fishery. And actually not just cod, other groundfish species, but particularly cod. So the cod collapse was 25 years ago, right about now. And for me, that was an example of not protecting the environment enough and thereby not protecting jobs and livelihoods. And ever since then, it's been something I've been looking at from that perspective. But that, of course, was a big deal. At a community level, the response of Eastport, Newfoundland to that cod collapse is something that's impressed me ever since then. That community, rather than giving up, started to do science. They did investigations of their lobster fishery. So the cod had collapsed, and it frankly wasn't their fault. They're just a small player in the whole cod fishery game. But they were then worried about their lobster fishery. So they started doing some research. They figured out where they should shut down their own fishing and not go fishing themselves to protect the lobster so they could grow up, the lobster could grow up and there'd be more lobster for them in the future. It's a logical thing, protecting the environment and sustaining their local economy of lobster fishing. So they figured out how to do that, and eventually they got the government to support what's called a marine protected area being developed and implemented right in their location there in Eastport, Newfoundland. But there's so many other examples, and so this Community Conservation Research Network, which is based here at St. Mary's University, is operating with colleagues all around the world. In about 25 sites, some of these dots are actually multiple communities in a particular location. And of course, when you look at these are the country names, except in Canada where they're sort of more local names. But of course, Brazil is a big place. And so our colleagues are just operating in certain communities in Brazil. And I'll mention Brazil a bit later on. So in 3 pictures, I want to give the basic idea of what we're talking about with community solutions. First picture is this woman here. Eleanor Ostrom was her name. She's passed away now. An absolutely wonderful human. I had the privilege of meeting and talking with her. She actually won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years back. Nobel Prize in Economics. The interesting thing about that, well, there's a number of interesting things, but one is that she wasn't an economist. She was actually a political scientist. But the reason she won was a basic insight, which was that people coming together and figuring things out in their community, leads to a better future for her. That's not Eleanor Ostrom as a kid there. That's a more recent picture. But that basically people can solve their own problems in a local way if they're given the power to do that. And that basically was Eleanor Ostrom's message that got her the Nobel Prize. And there's about 1,000 other people that are working on similar related research to look at how that works. And that's what our research network is trying to do. So we basically are looking at 3 key words: communities, conservation, and livelihoods, and how those 3 connect together. So communities, how are communities meeting their local environmental and economic challenges? Conservation, what can we learn from the experiences in conservation of local environments around the world? And livelihoods, how do the local conservation initiatives meet livelihood needs? Because conservation is a nice idea from an environmental point of view of protecting the environment. But what we found is that it's most successful when it's also sustaining people's lives, their well-being. Now, you get well-being from a healthy environment, but you also get well-being from having a livelihood that you can rely on, that's sustained over time. So that's the kind of angles that we're looking at. And there's so many examples around. Now, I want to, at this point, apologize to the many communities, especially in Nova Scotia, that I've missed here, because I've just picked out a few examples, some that I really admire in a Canadian context, but there's so many others. So I won't be talking about Digby Neck, even though Digby Neck has an incredible capability of community spirit that's so admirable. And I won't be talking about Clare, the municipality of Clare, where Metegan's located, even though they have just an amazing, again, a community spirit about protecting their fishery, protecting their coast and their land. I won't be talking about St. Margaret's Bay, even though St. Margaret's Bay has an amazing stewardship association that protects and studies not only the bay, but also the watersheds in that area. If I keep naming the places I won't talk about, I'll be in big trouble. So I'm going to start off Bear River First Nation. And some of these, so I'll be mixing together a sort of a range of examples here. And I'm just going to say a few words about that. So I'll apologize even to the ones I'm talking about, because I'm not doing them justice. Bear River First Nation. These are from provincial archives and are not actually Bear River First Nation, but I put this up just to remind us that actually the Mi'kmaq have been in this area for long before photographs were taken. And Bear River First Nation is for me a really wonderful example of, as are really so many indigenous communities, of that spirit of taking care of the environment and the link of the people and the environment. And even those words are not really appropriate, but I'll stick with them for now. So Bear River, like so many Mi'kmaq communities, has a strong culture, like drumming, but that's also reflected in a range of activities. And in fact, canoe making, this is Robbie McEwen here, canoe making is one of the big cultural features. And Bear River and Acadia First Nation, a number of the First Nations in this, the southern part of the province in particular, have a long history of canoe making. So the culture is strong, but there's also a recognition that not all is great in the environment. So this group there, Robbie and other colleagues in Bear River First Nation, set out to actually try to restore fish to the stream going through their land. And why did they need to try to restore something? Had they messed up in the past? Well, actually, no. They hadn't messed up on their land. The fish, of course, were coming from the ocean, and stuff happens in the ocean, like fish farming, for example, that their feeling is that the pollutants from the fish farms had actually hurt the young fish coming back into the stream on the land here. So they were doing their best to try to restore the habitat and improve the habitat to try to do what they could to get the fish coming back. Oh, sorry, I should say here. So that's I think, a success story in terms of the community coming together to do something that is both environmentally important, but also economically important and culturally significant, okay? Because the fish being there was, as in so many places, was just a really important aspect for their community. Now, I want to jump from Bear River to the Eastern Shore, where maybe some of you are familiar with the Eastern Shore. And you know, again, I'm not an expert on many of these locations at all, but I've been so impressed in various field trips to the Eastern Shore to see the kind of community spirit that is so apparent. So some of you might know, Musquodoboit Harbour, that this has been converted into a community center, this building, where all sorts of activities take place, and this isn't the only example of a school that's been converted. I'll talk about a couple of others as well. So up in the top left, you can see the words Musquodoboit Harbour Vision. And again, this is so impressive when communities are actually taking on the task of visioning and figuring out their future. And when I'm saying communities, these are not necessarily locations that have formal municipal councils. These are people that bring themselves together and in a very impressive way to plan out, to vision for the future. There's been a lot of efforts on the land, even though Musquodoboit Harbour is on the coast, but on the land there's efforts to develop model forests and to deal with deforestation. So from the community point of view, and this is not just one community at Musquodoboit Harbour, this is the Eastern Shore somewhat more broadly, that taking initiatives to deal with forest management. And some of you might have heard of the Deanery Project, again, a wonderful community initiative to build some understanding and community spirit in the Eastern Shore area. Now, I want to say a word about, I mentioned about Bear River First Nation. Sapagnagadee, or what was formerly called Indian Brook First Nation, is engaged in a very important challenge at the moment. Some of you might know that this morning there was a launch of a Bill of Environmental Rights for Nova Scotia. Anybody familiar with that here by any chance? No, a couple of you. So the launch of the proposed Bill of Environmental Rights for Nova Scotia in a press conference and event this morning was designed to deal with some of the challenges that many communities are facing around the province. And even though this is an Earth optimism discussion, the optimism sometimes comes not from what the community does to, let's say, clean up a stream or like in Bear River First Nation, but from active opposition to what would be damaging to them. And so in the case of Indian Brook and the Shubenacadie River, or the Sapaganagadi River, the issue is Alton Gas, this proposed natural gas storage site. And my CCRN colleague, who's with the Ecology Action Center, Sadie Beaton, has done a lot of work along with a whole coalition and led by the First Nation to deal with this question of what would happen with this if this Alberta-based Alton Gas was successful in basically drilling into a salt vein, flushing out that salt bed, dumping the waste that comes out of there into the river, into the Shubenacadie River, and basically using it as a storage facility. So the problem is the potential pollution of the river, loss of fish, loss of livelihoods, and loss of cultural values in the area. And as Sadie points out, not only does the Shubenacadie River have the largest tides in the world, it also holds a big cultural, spiritual importance to the Mi'kmaq people. And it's a source of food and livelihood as well. So here you have a kind of classic situation where, left to our own devices, left to the community's own situation without a threat coming in, they actually have sustainable livelihoods and a healthy, relatively healthy environment. And the threat is of losing all of that. So the Sapaganagadi First Nation was able to build an alliance. And I think the success here is not in physically moving rocks around or cleaning up something, but in building an alliance that includes non-Indigenous people, community activists, environmentalists, and a whole range of folks to do something about the threat and to try to highlight the importance of that river for livelihoods and essentially showing, by building a facility right by the river, showing the economic importance, the livelihood importance as well. So this effort to show respect and highlight the importance of the river is one of those examples of a community pulling together not only themselves, but a broader coalition as well. I want to move down to the South Shore, Port Mattoon, one of those places where the French language gets a little bit adapted, shall we say, in Port Mattoon. Wonderful spot. I work quite a bit with the community there, and what I don't know if you're familiar with all of these places or not, but for me this is a gem, and it's a gem because the people in Port Mattoon are so motivated, like those in Indian Brook in the Shubenacadie area, to do something about their future, to plan for their future. And so it's a fishing community, historically, fishing community, but also one that has growing tourism activity. This is Carter's Beach, a very nice beach that has, in recent years, had a large flood of tourists coming to it. But that's, in a way, good news. Well, of course, you could see the good news would be the economic aspect of more tourists coming in. But another aspect to that is that until a couple of years ago, this beach was rather polluted by a fish farm that was operating just off the shore. So what's that fish farm is not operating at the moment. The beach is and the water is cleaning up. Tourists are coming in, but now there's an issue about getting this Carter's Beach designated properly by the province so that it's not, or let's put it this way, so tourism is managed in a reasonable way. But I think the key thing for me in Port Mattoon is there's certainly a number of conflicts, there's a number of challenges. One challenge, well, music is nice, but no offense to these three, but the population is aging in Port Mattoon, and there's a great interest in bringing in livelihood capability, more jobs, in other words, that would bring young people back, keep young people there in the community. So this is true in various parts of Nova Scotia, as you probably are aware. So there's a great interest in creating jobs, but in Port Mattoon, there's a strong concern about the environment, and that's accompanied by a feeling that jobs are important, but not at any cost. So the interesting challenge in Port Mattoon is coming together to figure out what does that green economy look like. And they're not the only ones to do that in the province, but they happen to be a community that I'm working with, to try to look at that idea of a green economy is basically jobs that are compatible with environmental health. The fishery is still strong in Port Mattoon, and they want to keep it that way, so they certainly don't want anything that's going to hurt the bay there. So the visioning activity that's taking place, and part of our research here is to actually explore around Nova Scotia and look for other communities that are doing the kind of planning and visioning that you're seeing here on this, on this piece of paper in a meeting in Port Mattoon that led to some particular ideas that were coming out of what does the future hold for our community. If you know of a community that's doing that kind of forward planning, forward thinking, please let me know later on, because that's something that I am trying to assemble and connect together communities, because often communities don't, it's not easy to know what each other is doing. So being able to make the connections is part of our goal. Now, that was a mix of examples in Nova Scotia, and I want to give a few that go a little bit wider. So Lennox Island, Prince Edward Island, is in Melpec Bay, famous for oysters. Lennox Island is a First Nation community, and a very, very attractive one, I think. So on the western side of Prince Edward Island here, community on the coast, in the bay. Fishing is important, but so is agriculture and forest use. And tourism has become relevant too. They have a wonderful cultural center. So if you're ever wandering around Prince Edward Island, I'd highly recommend. They're somewhat small, but very interesting cultural center. And there's another picture of the cultural center in the top left there. But the point I want to make about Lennox Island, and here's an aerial view of Lennox Island. I don't know if you can tell from the picture here, but Lennox Island is a very flat, low, non-mountainous community. It's basically very vulnerable to climate change, to sea level rise, to storm surges coming from the ocean. And so that's been a big project for Lennox Island, is planning for climate change, planning ahead for what are they going to do. And in fact, they've been recently the subject of a National Geographic story that you can find online about the challenge of a low-lying community dealing with rising sea levels, storms, and so on. It's a challenge. And the other aspect that's relevant there is that archaeological artifacts that date back thousands of years are all around the area, on Lennox Island and on nearby sandbars. Well, you can imagine sandbars, as the sea level comes up and more storms are hitting, sandbars are very vulnerable. So they've actually, you know, as a community that's like all communities, just they're trying to make ends meet, but they've actually started up emergency archaeology work to try to save what's culturally important to them, these artifacts, before they're gone. The Innu Nation in Labrador. This Innu Nation is actually a partner in our community conservation project. They're a full partner, just as the Ecology Action Center is a full partner in our international project. And it's been wonderful to have a chance to work with the Innu Nation. You might know the name of the community, Sheshatshiu. Over the years, Sheshatshiu has been in the news often in a negative context. They're facing a lot of issues, health issues, suicides, deaths are all too common. But we've been working with the Innu Nation, which is largely two communities, Sheshatshiu being one of them. And this is a picture of Sheshatshiu. Well, part of it anyway. We've been working with the Innu to look at how to develop their environmental policies so that as a set of communities, Innu communities, so Innu, by the way, are not Inuit. There are Inuit in Labrador as well, but Innu are also there. So Innu are more of the First Nation classification, I guess, if I put it that way. Well, the Innu are in two major communities, and one being Sheshatshiu. This is the public school in Sheshatshiu, where we had a meeting where the community came together, and in particular the elders came together with the environment group of the Innu Nation to look at what environmental policy looks like from an Innu perspective, from an indigenous perspective, in particular Innu perspective. And we met in this, this wonderful hall, which is, well, the school's gymnasium and assembly room, I guess you could say. I've rarely been in a room as well decorated as this one. So if you look on the walls there, it's just amazing, the art on the walls and the photos and so on. So we met there. The man in the middle, Richard Nuna, is the head of the environment group. And I mention this because this is an example of a set of small communities really trying to plan for the future. Now, they have a fair bit of territory, and they are facing a range of proposals where they need to decide, do we want to be part of a mining operation? How are we responding to the hydroelectric project in Labrador, the one that's supposed to bring electricity here to Nova Scotia? They are on the front lines of the potential impacts from these, but also some of the economic benefits. So that connection of the environment and the economy is a really strong thing there. Now, Helen here, I wanted to show you this because I find this really impressive. So I was sitting in the group here around those tables while Helen was describing and Helen had been working with the Community Conservation Project, describing in the Innu language what environmental policy might look like. So Atik here is caribou. Caribou are the iconic species for the Innu. They are the salmon, what salmon is to West Coast Indigenous people out in British Columbia. In Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq, it might be moose, but also eel. Moose and eel are in a sense iconic. I don't want to overemphasize, but because it would be up to each community to say what's important to them, but very clearly the caribou is at the center of the circle here. So environmental policy, you can see some of the, this is referring to the Innu land claim that revolves around the whole thing. Here are some negative aspects, contaminants, noise, and so on. You can see this is written primarily in English because actually one of our non-Innu colleagues was helping to design this particular artwork, but Helen was presenting it entirely in the Innu language. And the basic idea, as elders were sitting there listening to the discussion, they were bringing in the ideas of traditional knowledge and traditional thinking about the connection with nature and what would be appropriate, what's the learning over time. And young people, this is in a school, right? So the wonderful thing about this, we rented out the hall in the school, but that didn't keep the kids from using the school, and so they were coming in to talk to their parents and grandparents and so on. So the whole effort was really for her, right? The idea is protecting the environment and livelihoods for the future. Now, out on the west coast, I just was mentioning the west coast, I want to say a word about the Nuchalnath area, which is the west coast of Vancouver Island. So there's British Columbia out west, and here is a map of, so the small map up here, Vancouver is down there, Victoria is down around here somewhere, and so the whole western side of Vancouver Island is Nuchalnath territory. That's one of the first nation, one of the nations in British Columbia. So they have a huge area up and down the coast. So in that area is Tofino, which surfers might be aware of, or you might just know it because it's a gorgeous place to visit. Tofino and Ucluelet, which is there as well. Those are perhaps the major communities. Bamfield, some of you might know. Anyway, there's small communities up and down the coast, including Ahousaht, which is one of the Nuchalnath communities, actually on an island just off the coast. Clayoquot Sound is the area where that's located. Well, the Nuchalnath, as with other Indigenous organizations, including here in Nova Scotia, have put a lot of effort into taking care of the world that they're living in, their land, their sea, the territory there. So Uathluk is the Nuchalnath word for, well, taken care of, which probably for us English speakers, maybe there's other English speakers here who would say, well, that's an odd term, taking care of. Like, taking care of what? Like, aren't you waiting for the thing that you're taking care of? Taking care of the world, the environment, something, the people, what is it? But in this case, Uathluk is basically the principle. It's the concept of taking care of everything. Right? So taking care of the people, taking care of the land, and so on. So they have been doing amazing work on scientific efforts. In fact, science that combines with traditional knowledge. If you're interested in this, we in the Community Conservation Research Network just had a webinar that will soon be online on our website by Dawn Foxcroft, who is one of the colleagues in the CCRN network. And so it'll be online there for you if you're interested in hearing more about their situation. In fact, she's talking in particular about the links of youth and elders and how conservation arises when youth are linked in with elders. But not all is easy there, because like in Nova Scotia with the proposed Bill of Environmental Rights to try to deal with some of these issues with new developments, on the West Coast they're dealing with a court case, the Nuchalnath, a court case over fishing rights with the federal government. So it's been a long-standing effort that may well be resolved fairly soon. Everything that the Nuchalnath do is based on two main principles. Everything is one, everything is connected, Sawalk, and Ithak means respect and caring for everyone. Right? So taking care of and respect are interlinked in that sense. So these are guiding principles that many other Indigenous communities have, or nations have as well. Okay, I want to move outside of Canada for a couple of cases, but I'm going to go quickly through these, but welcome your any questions later on. So in Brazil, as I mentioned, Brazil's a big place. We're just looking in one particular spot that is in the somewhat the southern area of Brazil, and this Paraty area, where a big issue has come up in terms of connections of fisheries and tourism conflicting with protected areas. So you remember I mentioned earlier that Eastport in Newfoundland had initiated, the fishing people there, the community had initiated their own protected area to take care of their local environment, to keep their livelihood secure. To me, that's a shining example of a community conservation initiative. But most places in the world, the protected areas the local people are not invited to create protected areas. Instead, protected areas are imposed from top down. And that leads to all sorts of conflict, and probably nowhere in the world more than in South Africa. But in Brazil, there was that conflict, but through various measures of the community working with actually university people, they managed to deal with this matter of protected areas around this bay through a number of agreements. Agreements of the fishing people and the protected areas people to have a kind of monitoring process, agreement of the fishers and boaters with protected areas, a new park management plan that had more community participation, and wildlife conservation that was based on local stewardship, local communities taking care of the environment. And once again, I guess in each community that I'm giving an example of here, I could show you a picture like this and like the one I showed before, people coming together to figure things out. Punta Allen, Mexico, I highly recommend if you're ever a tourist in Mexico. This is this is just south of Cancun. So some of you may have been to or know of Cancun because it's a big place where politicians go to talk about things. Punta Allen is a tiny little community a bit south of there, right in a biosphere reserve. It's sort of the main community, but still small within a biosphere reserve. Very nice spot. You can see that this is the sign at the entrance where there's bird watching and turtle watching tourism possibilities there. So typical kind of tropical, nice spot. And these are typical fishing boats in the area. And the reason I wanted to mention this particular community is because of this rather strange, complex aerial satellite photo with a bunch of lines on it. They have lobster in Punta Allen. They have lobster. It's a spiny lobster. It's a different species from what we have here, but it's very tasty, quite expensive, and good for their local economy as long as you can sustain the population of lobster. So again, think Eastport, Newfoundland, lobster. They created protected areas, a protected area for lobster in Eastport, Newfoundland. In Punta Allen, they created a kind of what's called territorial use rights. So they created territories for each individual fishing family so that each one has its own territory to go fishing for lobster. And so basically they've divided up the pie, the area, among them so that they cut down, they eliminate competition in a way. But a wonderful community aspect is that if somebody has a particular situation one year where the lobster just are not there in some cases relatively small little areas, the community will meet, the fishers will meet, and figure out a way for that particular family or person to be given access somewhere else. Usually they are allowed to go fishing with whoever has another area and is willing to share. So the sharing idea is a big thing in this location. And I think finally, Galapagos Islands. Galapagos Islands, lots of cool species, interesting spot. The whole place almost is a national park. Almost the whole land and ocean is a national park there. And there's these critters that are fun to see and look at and so on. But behind what the tourists normally see are fishing people like these. Now, fishing, you might think, is in conflict with tourism because tourists want to go snorkeling or diving and see fish, and these people are catching fish. So that would seem to be a bit of a problem. But in fact, these boats, they are working this out. It's not always easy, but they're working this out by having the fishing boats fish in certain locations. They're figuring out, in fact, a student of mine, second from the right here, Mauricio Castrillon, he had been at this time, when I I was there taking this picture. He was with WWF in the Galapagos Islands. He then came here to Halifax to work on his doctoral thesis. He's now back in the Galapagos Islands with a different NGO called Conservation International, and still working with these people, the fishing people, to figure out where they need to fish to make a living and where is the biodiversity most important that needs protecting. So they're trying to work out through a kind of spatial, working out the areas of where these two can coexist. So a very nice, again, a community-based example. Oh yes, oh, sorry, one more case. Koh Phi Island in Thailand, and this is a small island just off the mainland in Thailand, in the south of Thailand. Small place, 43 homes, mostly fishing, but also other activities, and tourism has become big here. Now, tourism has meant a lot of interest in community conservation, where they're combining culture and their beliefs to participate in their decision making. They're sharing, just like with Punta Allen, Mexico, they're sharing in the community the resources, and they're increasingly understanding the value of the natural resources, mostly fishery-based, and connecting with tourists. So in that case, community tourism, and this is really their innovation that is so, in this small little community, an amazing innovation where they basically have pioneered a situation of what we would call homestays. So their tourism that they decided was most fitting for them was to have tourists, not big hotels, but tourists staying in their homes. Now, a lot of people wouldn't want that. I mean, not everybody wants tourists coming and staying in their home, but those people who run a bed and breakfast might like that. But in this community, they have really taken it on as a community. And so it means that tourists who are coming are going to get an authentic experience. They better not go there if they don't want the authentic experience, because that is basically what is the design in this case. And again, it's not unique, but in the Thailand setting, it was quite innovative. Well, I'm running out of time, so here's a whole bunch of messages that we came up with in our efforts, and I'm going to jump through them relatively quickly here. So these are 6 guidelines that when we met together with people from around the world, this was what we came up with as 6 guiding principles for how communities can be empowered to solve environmental and economic problems themselves at the same time with the support from governments. First of all, to do environmental conservation right, you need to use the knowledge of local and indigenous communities. Community conservation is essential to the livelihoods of the people, so that is something that's needed, conservation at community level. Allowing for the active engagement of local and indigenous communities improves conservation, whoever is doing the conservation, whether it is governments or industries or municipalities or the communities themselves. Conversely, if communities are excluded, which we found around the world is actually a fairly common situation, then you're more likely to have conflict, unsustainability, and resource decline. This was actually the headline of our press release that we put out, was that we decided to go negative and say, if you exclude communities, don't think you're just excluding them and nothing's going to happen. You're actually more likely to get bad results. Governments and businesses need to have respectful partnerships with communities. That gives better understanding and better decision-making, better results. And finally, building capacity leads to empowered communities. So communities can do a lot on their own, but building capacity can also be really necessary. Okay, so we did all this in this effort that's still ongoing, and there's just a few pictures from around the world. But we have always been conscious that there are all these other examples out there. And I mentioned apologetically some that I haven't talked about so far. So, we know that there's this inspiring work in communities around the world. We've documented some of those. But these thousands of community initiatives often go under the radar. They don't necessarily get government support. And all that work in local communities here and there has never really been brought together in one place. So we argued that we need a way to help a community share experiences by bringing things together, highlighting how much is going on globally, and learning what works best by comparing a whole range of cases. That led us to create something that just started last month. It's called Communities in Action. And basically, this is a web-based, an online effort to showcase local communities around the world on an interactive map that gives information about each community, what kind of environmental challenge it faced, how that affected their livelihoods, and what did they do about it, what was done about it. So we have a website that's active now, where you can have a look, but you can also participate. You can contribute a story. You can look on the map to see how communities are dealing with these challenges, and you can add to the map. And it's all at this website, communityconservation.net. Now, this is a screenshot of what it looks like, but I just want to take a moment, if I can do that. Well, okay, actually, let me just, go on to here. If this is something of interest to you, if you have a community that you are passionate about, you might live in it, or you just might care about it, or you might know a lot about it as an outsider, and you'd like to contribute to this initiative, then you basically go to the website communityconservation.net and click on Communities in Action. And if my little technology works here, this might actually open up. We're just getting started. We're hoping that there will be examples added on. So far, we have mostly our own examples from our team around the world. Let's see here. Don't enable. So this first, I think, is our general community conservation website. And, oh, okay, I don't want that. Okay, so there is our website, communityconservation.net. And if you click anywhere you see Communities in Action, then here we go. There, good. Okay. So our Communities in Action website is a place that you can actually look at examples from around the world. But if you get inspired, you can also share a community story by inputting on a questionnaire. So what this looks like live here is this map at the moment. Each little icon is a particular case. So for example, if we click on this one over here, the map kind of goes around the world here, but Shiratoko in Japan is home to many coastal rural communities which rely on primary resource production for their livelihoods. If you want to hear more about Shiratoko, there's each one of these dots on the map has a website connected to it. And so this particular one is a national park in the north of Japan that you can see on the little map here. And what we describe for each community is the top environmental challenge it's faced, how the environmental challenge has affected livelihoods, the community response, and the government support or non-support. And then a little bit of extra information with keywords and so on. So for each example, you can get a sense, and we're hoping that students in schools might have a look at this, because each example is one that can be explored a bit further. And like I say, for those who actually have an example to share, they can click on the Share a Community Story spot. So what we're hoping is our work is still looking at these various 25 communities around the world, but we're hoping to bring together many more and build a system where people can actually, communities can see their experiences portrayed. And the way we put it is literally putting the community on the map. So this is the map in this case. So that is, I think, about it. For me, I want to just highlight again that, as I said at the start, tonight's part of an Earth Optimism version of Earth Day events. It's really great to be partnering with Ecology Action Center in organizing this set of events. And so tomorrow there is a range of Ecology Action Center events that you might be interested in. That's it for my presentation. So again, on behalf of the School of Environment at St. Mary's, thank you so much. Good night.